Celestial Puppeteers. Chapter 1. The Artifact. The deep void of space stretched endlessly, its silence pressing against the walls of Erebus Station. Suspended on the edge of a swirling black hole, the station was a fragile speck against the abyss, a monument to human arrogance. Commander Jonas Mercer stood by the reinforced viewport, staring into the endless dark. The black hole VX-11 was a gaping maw, its event horizon pulsing with ghostly light. It swallowed everything matter, time, even light itself. Yet, for reasons no one understood, Erebus remained untouched. Commander, you need to see this. The voice of Dr. Evelyn Carter, the lead astrophysicist, crackled through Mercer's earpiece. He turned from the window and made his way to Lab 3, his heavy boots echoing through the empty corridor. Discovery. Lab 3 was bathed in dim, artificial light. The walls were lined with monitors, their displays flickering with erratic data streams. A group of scientists stood around a large containment unit, whispering. Inside the reinforced glass chamber was an object unlike anything they had ever seen. A perfect obsidian sphere, about the size of a human head, hovered an inch above the metal platform. Thin white tendrils of energy coiled around it, shifting like smoke trapped in zero gravity. It was found in the debris field outside the station, Dr. Carter explained, her face pale. We have no idea how it got there. There was no record of any known technology matching this thing. Mercer approached the containment unit, staring at the sphere. Something about it felt wrong. Is it dangerous? He asked. We don't know, Carter admitted, but it emits a strange gravitational field. The readings keep changing. It's almost like it's alive. Mercer narrowed his eyes. Alive? Not in a biological sense. More like it's aware. Silence filled the room. Everyone could feel it. The presence, the weight in the air. It wasn't just an object. It was watching them. The first sign. That night, the station changed. Technician Caleb Henshaw was alone in the control room when the lights flickered. A cold sweat prickled his skin as he heard something behind him. A whisper. Low. Hollow. He spun around, but no one was there. The monitors flickered violently, displaying random symbols and numbers. Then in a flash, the screen showed his own face but distorted, twisted into an inhuman grin. Caleb staggered back. Then the whisper came again. Inside his head, Caleb opened the chamber. His breath caught in his throat. His hands moved on their own, reaching for controls. Let me in. He fought against it. He clenched his fists, trying to stop his own body. But the whispers grew louder. And then he reached for the override switch. The chamber opens. Dr. Carter awoke to the sound of alarms. She grabbed her communicator. What the hell is going on? The artifact has been released. Her heart stopped. She rushed to Lab 3, where Mercer and Soren were already there, staring at the containment unit. It was empty. The sphere was gone. Then the station groaned. The metal walls shuddered as if something massive was pressing against them. The gravity fluctuated, making the air feel heavier. Mercer turned to the others, his face grim. We're not alone anymore. Chapter 2. The First Host. The silence in Erebus Station had changed. It was no longer the natural quiet of deep space. the absence of sound that came with drifting between the stars. This silence was unnatural. Something was listening. The station's metal corridors stretched like veins of a dead creature, dim lights flickering as though the station itself was struggling to stay awake. Somewhere within, the artifact had vanished, leaving only an unsettling sense of presence behind. The crew searched. Every hallway, every vent, every locked chamber. Nothing, but the station was different now. The walls groaned as though shifting under some unseen weight. The temperature fluctuated erratically, and shadows seemed too long, as if cast by an unseen light source. It was alive in a way it hadn't been before. Then the first incident happened. The drifting man. Caleb Henshaw was missing. The moment the artifact vanished, he had disappeared too. The security logs showed him in Lab 3, standing over the containment unit. Then, in the next frame, he was gone. No alarms, no forced exits. Just gone. Mercer led the search team down to engineering, where Caleb had last been seen before the artifact's discovery. The air was stale, thick with the scent of oil and burning circuits. Then a sound, a slow, wet dragging noise echoed from the far end of the chamber. A steady, unnatural rhythm. Mercer raised his flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, shaking slightly as he moved it forward. The noise grew closer, and then they saw him. Caleb stood motionless, barely visible in the dim corridor. His body floated inches above the floor, as if gravity had loosened its grip on him. His limbs hung unnaturally, fingers twitching as if responding to unseen strings. His head tilted downward, face obscured by shadow. No breathing, no blinking, just waiting. "Caleb?" Mercer whispered, though he already knew something was terribly wrong. The room suddenly shook not from an explosion or a mechanical failure, but from something else. A low, deep pulse reverberated through the walls, as though the station itself had just exhaled. Caleb's head snapped up. The crew gasped. His face was wrong. His eyes, once blue, were now pure black, reflecting the dim light like polished stone. His mouth curled into something that resembled a smile, but too wide, stretching the skin of his cheeks unnaturally. He moved forward, but not like a man. His feet barely touched the ground, his body jerking in unnatural spasms, as if adjusting to the motion of a puppet's strings. His shadow stretched behind him, far longer than it should have been, crawling across the walls. Then, without warning, he lunged. The changing crew. Caleb was restrained, but not before two crew members were injured in the struggle. The med bay's sterile lights shone down on his unmoving form, strapped to the examination table. His body was still, but the air around him pulsed strangely, like a heat mirage in the vacuum of space. Dr. Carter ran her scans. His heart rate was erratic, his temperature dropping below human levels, his neural activity spiking in patterns that made no sense. But there was one reading that terrified her the most. His gravitational field had changed. Every living thing had a minor gravitational pull, barely measurable. But Caleb's readings were fluctuating wildly, shifting between normal and something far beyond human comprehension. Something was inside him, or worse, something was becoming him. Mercer watched from the observation window. Caleb lay still, breathing slow, but his lips moved. Mercer leaned closer. Then, in the dead silence of the medbay, Caleb spoke. A whisper, not his own voice. You could not stop it. The lights flickered. Caleb's body convulsed violently, his back arching off the table as though an invisible force was pulling him upward. The restraint snapped, the metal bending as if subjected to some unseen gravitational force. Then, as suddenly as it started, he collapsed. A heartbeat later, he was gone. The fractured station. Caleb wasn't the only one changing. The rest of the crew began experiencing strange anomalies. Chief Engineer Lena Voss woke in her quarters to find her own reflection moving out of sync with her. She reached to the mirror, her fingers brushing the surface, and the reflection smiled back at her before she did. Security Officer Dante Wells claimed to hear voices whispering in the ventilation shafts his own voice, speaking in a tone that wasn't his. Dr. Carter suffered the worst. She lost time. One moment she was in Lab 3, running tests. The next, she was standing in the docking bay, her hands covered in someone else's blood. The station's reality was shifting, and at the center of it all, the artifact. The artifact calls. Deep within the station, hidden from view, the obsidian sphere hovered in the dark, but it was no longer an object. It breathed. It pulsed. It waited. A presence swelled inside it, stretching beyond the station, beyond time itself. The Erebus crew was no longer alone. Something else was here. Something ancient. Something vast. And it was just getting started. Chapter 3. The Hollow Ones. The station groaned. Not the usual hum of machinery or the distant clatter of shifting metal. No, the sound was different. It was as if something enormous was breathing through the walls. A slow, deep inhalation that rattled the bones of the Erebus station, stretching through its halls like an unseen force pressing against reality itself. The artifact pulsed, unseen in its hidden chamber. A silent command rippled outward, and across the station, things began to change. The watching eyes. Mercer had stopped sleeping. He knew something was wrong with the station, and sleep was a weakness he couldn't afford. His muscles ached, his head throbbed, but fear kept his eyes open. As he walked through the silent corridors, he felt them, the eyes. At first, he thought it was just exhaustion, shadows playing tricks. But then he realized the shadows weren't right. He would pass a bulkhead and see movement in his peripheral vision. But when he turned, nothing was there, until one night, deep in the empty halls of Erebus, he caught his own reflection moving without him. The glass panel beside him rippled, like the surface of black water. His reflection remained perfectly still, watching him even as he took a step forward. Then it smiled. A slow, deliberate grin stretched across the face in the reflection. Not his own. Mercer's breath hitched. The reflection's lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear. Then it blinked out of sync with him. He staggered back. His hand instinctively reached for his holster, but when he looked again, the reflection was normal. But Mercer knew the truth. Something else was here, and it was wearing his face. The Hollow One's walk. Lena Voss had been missing for 7 hours. The last security log showed her entering the engine bay, but there was no record of her leaving. No radio calls. No distress signal. Just silence. Then, at exactly 0400 station time, she returned. The medbay cameras captured her standing at the threshold of the infirmary, motionless. She didn't walk in, she floated. Her boots barely touched the metal grating as she drifted forward, her movement slow and unnatural. Dr. Carter, still shaken from her own blackouts, approached cautiously. "Lena," she whispered. The woman turned her head, too slowly, like a machine trying to remember how to move. Her eyes were black voids. Not just the pupils, all of it. No whites, no irises. Just endless, hungry darkness. Dr. Carter stepped back, instinct screaming at her to run. Lena's mouth twitched, too wide. Then she spoke. But it wasn't Lena's voice. It was a chorus of whispers layered atop one another. Words that didn't fit together. Voices that belonged to people long dead. "We are here." Dr. Carter pressed the emergency alarm, but it was too late. Lena wasn't the only one. Across the station, they emerged. Crew members who had vanished returned, but they were different. They walked the halls with floating steps, their movements jerking like puppets on invisible strings. Their faces were recognizable, but their expressions were wrong. Their skin stretched too tight, their limbs too fluid, as if their bones had been replaced with something else. They spoke in unison, whispering words in a language that made the ears ring and the mind fracture. And worst of all, they were growing in numbers. The breach. By the time Mercer reached command, half the station was gone. Not dead, not missing. Worse, they were walking shells, empty vessels filled with the will of something else. Mercer locked the doors. His pulse pounded as he scanned the security feeds. Everywhere figures move in eerie synchronization. They stood in circles, heads tilted, listening to something only they could hear. Their mouths moved, but no sound came from them. The way they tilted their heads like they were waiting for something to answer. Then a low hum filled the station, a frequency so deep it rattled teeth, vibrated through the walls, through their skulls. The artifact. Mercer clutched his ears. Static exploded across the security monitors. The cameras flickered, and for a single, terrifying second, they showed something else. Not the station, not the possessed crew, but a vast, endless expanse of writhing limbs, stretching into infinity. 1,000 hollowed faces, their eyes black pits of cosmic hunger, turning toward him. The screen went black. And then the whisper came, "Come to us." The door behind Mercer clicked open. He turned and saw himself standing in the doorway, his own face staring back at him, and it smiled. Chapter 4, The Last Ascent. The station was no longer theirs. It had become something else, a living thing, pulsing with unseen rhythms, bending and shifting in ways that defied reason. The walls breathed, their surfaces flexing like muscle, dark veins of alien origin twisting through the metal. Gravity flickered, pulling at odd angles, making simple movement an exhausting battle against an invisible tide. Somewhere, deep within the station, the artifact pulsed, sending its whispers through the void. The possessed crew moved in harmony, their steps soundless, their voices murmuring in a language that seeped into mind like an infection. Mercer had tried to ignore them at first, but the whispers always found a way in sliding into his thoughts, making him doubt himself. He was the only one left. At least, he thought he was. The false path. The emergency corridors had collapsed into nonsense geometry. Mercer ran to the dark halls, his breath ragged, his mind struggling to hold on to reality. One moment, he was heading toward the docking bay, then he turned a corner and found himself back at the med bay, where Lena's empty body still stood, watching him with those bottomless black eyes. He turned and ran the other way, forcing himself down a new path, his boots slamming against a metal floor. But when he emerged from the next passage, he was in the same place. The station had folded around him. It was reshaping itself, trapping him in an infinite loop, keeping him where it wanted him to be. He felt the weight of the artifacts while pressing against his mind. It was inside the station, inside the walls, inside him. He tried again, charging through another set of corridors, forcing his way toward the reactor bay. He knew where the artifact was hidden now. It had to be destroyed. But as he ran, the lights overhead flickered, and in the dim, shifting glow, he saw them. Figures, shifting and blurred, standing in the corners of his vision, watching, waiting. They had no faces, just smooth, empty masks where human features should have been. And then they stepped toward him, the hollowed mind. Mercer didn't remember collapsing, but he was suddenly on the floor, his vision swimming, his body shaking. Something was inside his mind, pulling at his thoughts, unraveling them thread by thread. He could feel the whispers now, no longer just outside of him, but within him, creeping into the quiet spaces of his soul. "You are ready." The voice wasn't spoken. It was felt, an impression sinking deep into his bones. Mercer struggled to his knees. His limbs felt wrong, too light, too distant, like they belonged to someone else. He tried to move, but the air had become thick, pushing against him, pulling him down. His head tilted against his will, and he saw something impossible. A crack had formed in the air itself, just a few meters away. A jagged wound in reality, showing something beyond the station's walls. Through it, Mercer glimpsed the truth. A world beyond human understanding. A colossal, shifting mass of tendrils and eyes, stretching across the void like a living nebula. Not a being, not a creature, something more. It had been waiting. "You will ascend." The words weren't a command. They were a certainty. Mercer felt his body responding, without his consent. His hand reached toward the crack. His mind fought, but his flesh obeyed. His fingers brushed the edge of the rift. And then he was somewhere else. The void between. There was no sound, no station, no walls, no gravity, just darkness. Mercer drifted in an abyss of silent, watching things. They had no form, yet he could feel their presence pressing in from all sides. They had always been here, waiting, watching, whispering across the boundaries of existence. The artifact had not been an object. It had been a beacon. A door left ajar, calling something through. Mercer felt himself unraveling, his memories spilling out like sand slipping through open fingers. The thing in the dark pressed closer, its voice curling around his thoughts, rewriting them. "You are ready to become." His skin tingled, shifting, losing its structure. He tried to scream, but his mouth was no longer his own. His limbs twisted, stretching into shadows. His face melted, his body reshaping itself into something new, something empty, something waiting. And then the signal repeats. The emergency beacon of the Erebus station pulsed in the dark void of space. A distress signal, a call for help. Somewhere, a rescue ship answered. Its crew prepared for boarding. They did not know. They did not understand. But soon they would. They always did.